It's good to be with you guys. Excited to talk about missions. It's a little bit of a niche topic, and so I'm excited to be able to have some interaction and hopefully be able to explore some of this stuff together. Why don't we just go, Lord? God, we're so grateful for the time that we have together. And Lord, I just pray that you will begin to just move upon our hearts and our minds. And Lord, that we will just be able to explore this idea of connection between discipleship and missions and what does that mean for our lives. But Lord, I just pray that you will do more than just an information download, that our hearts will begin to be challenged. Lord, that we'll be just encouraged. And Lord, that you will just extend grace over the next few moments just for all of us so that your name can be made great, so that we can bring you glory in all that we do. We love you, Jesus, and we're so very, very grateful in your precious name. Amen. I'm going to start the session just to try to give a little bit of a brief background, follow up with where we come from and what God's been doing in and through our lives. My name is Paul Burkhart. My wife, Crystal, and our family, we helped pioneer Alaska Chi Alpha 4 years ago. Simultaneously, two teams pioneered in Anchorage and in Fairbanks. And God's been doing just some great things. We've seen just some genuine moves of the Lord, but it's been through discipleship. Alaska is a unique place, and I think discipleship, small group discipleship, what we know in Chi Alpha is really suited to fit in a place like that. But our family came to Chi Alpha kind of in a unique way. We did not necessarily come the typical route of growing up in it and then doing the CMIT and then stepping into our family. We went to Central Bible College. Both my wife and I, we met there, married shortly after, went into pastoral ministry. We were both pastoral ministry majors, missions majors. We knew that in order to be a missionary in the Assemblies of God back in that day, you had to be a pastor. So you kind of do the pastoral ministry major with the minor in missions, because no one will hire a missions major because you know they're leaving. And so we ended up doing that and spent the obligatory 5 years at a local church in near Cleveland, Ohio, before we started to make our applications to go overseas. And we were part of a team that re-pioneered Laos for the Assemblies of God. Laos is a closed communist nation in Southeast Asia. It's surrounded by Thailand, Vietnam, Burma. To the north is China, and that part of the world. And was essentially the foundation of what both my wife and I, the culmination rather, of what both my wife and I had thought our lives were going to be about. And the tragedy or the sad thing about that is that when we landed in Asia, it took all of about 6 or 7 months for me to figure out that my entire life, I grew up as a pastor's kid. I kind of was groomed into missions from just an early childhood. Just that was put in my heart and in my mind, that all of that was really absolutely, frankly, worthless and useless as tools. I got into a country that was closed, it was communist, it was persecuted, and I had been trained my whole life to preach sermons, to run an organization, to do what we would call church in the West. And it didn't take very long for us to figure out that we had no skills and no ability to affect change in a nation that God had called us to. And what ended up happening was about 6 or 7 months in, I walked to the doorway of our home that we were renting, and it overlooked this rice field, and we had a coconut grove to the right. And I just remember being overwhelmed with this feeling and knowledge that we were essentially wasting time. And I couldn't reconcile it. I couldn't understand what God had called us to, the years, literally years that had brought us to this point of preparation. And in just a few months, realizing we were not prepared to really do anything he'd called us to. And tears just started to form and flow down my cheeks. And I started to say, God, what is this about? What are we supposed to do? How can we make a change in this place? And it's so vivid in my mind. It was just a few words. He said, go make a friend. And I remember looking out, it was the monsoon season, and it's just buckets, pouring buckets of rain. I can't even describe what that looks like. And off on the edge of the property in a tin shack we wouldn't put chickens in, 2 squatters were living on the corner. And I could see into this open doorway of their hut, and I could see that they were playing cards. And that go make friends, go make a friend wasn't just like a philosophical idea. It was like a command, like right now, go make friends. And I remember opening the door wall and running across this field and diving into this tin shack to these two 17-year-old, 19-year-old Lao guys who didn't speak English, and I barely spoke like 4 words of Lao. It terrified them. I about knocked the shack down because, Lao people are 5'2" and 85 pounds, and I'm 6'6", 200 plus. And there was this moment of fear in everybody's eyes, right? And we're looking at each other, and they're playing cards, and I just assumed I'd jump in. And so we're doing the sign language thing, trying to figure this out. And I get a hand of cards, and we're playing. And about halfway through the first hand, I realized that we were playing for shots, that there was a rice whiskey bottle, and there were cups there. And all of a sudden, I have this moral dilemma, right? Because I'm an AGWM missionary, grew up in the assemblies, and I know for a fact to take a drink of alcohol is to sentence yourself to hell for eternity. And I also know that the Lord told me to come into this hut and to make friends. And so I'm trying to put these things together, and we're playing cards, and I'm going, Lord, don't let me lose, don't let me lose. And then I figured out it's really easy to cheat drunk people, and I did not lose one hand the rest of the night, right? But the moral of the story, listen, the moral of the story is that Dang and Dom, the 17 and 19-year-old boys that came into our lives, who eventually moved into our home, became our first disciples. And it put us, our family, on this journey of discipleship, and it became this buzzword in our home because the Lord began to open up our eyes and our understanding that we weren't there to build a church. We weren't there to establish necessarily an organization or even a movement. We were there to make disciples. And all of a sudden, our world began to shift, and we began to explore what does that look like. And it's sad to say that I grew up in a movement that is a Pentecostal, God-following movement, but I'd grown up in a world that I didn't know what that looked like, and I didn't know how to do it. And I remember so vividly the first time we encountered Chi Alpha. We've been doing this for about 3 years. We were overseas. These two guys had begun to follow Jesus. Dang was our first follower. Dom was like 4 years later. He'd tell me he was 50% saved. Then he was 65% saved. He was just kind of working his way into what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. And we got asked to come back to the World Mission Summit, the second one in Cincinnati. And I think it was because we were the youngest people in the region, and they thought we might actually relate to college students at that time. And we sat down at this table to do a meal with the missionary. And we're talking, and I get this group of just guys that I'm not sure any of them are walking with Jesus by the way they're dressed, by the way they're looking, they're talking to each other. And I'm just like, oh, Lord, what are you going to do with this? Well, halfway through the conversation, we're talking about Laos and missions, and I'm asking them about their lives. And they're like, oh, well, we're about to go pioneer this campus ministry at UTSA. And I'm like, oh, wow, you guys, like, yeah, we're going to be ministers, and this is going to be awesome, missionaries. And I'm just like scratching my head going, wow, I didn't know you guys were walking with Jesus. This is amazing. And at the end of the conversation, he goes, you got to meet this other guy we know, a guy named Eli. And he introduced me to Eli Gotro, and a few months later, we were back on our furlough, and Johnny Howe called me, and he's like, man, we just pioneered. We got nothing, like a few students together. We'd love to have you come and visit us, but I can't really bring you in, and so Eli's going to bring you in for a little bit. Can you go to Huntsville at Sam, and can you do this? And I thought, as a typical missionary, I'd go, I'd show up, I'd talk to 5 or 6 students, I'd preach to 45 students, because I didn't know what Sam was at that point. And then I'd go to UTSA and do it all over again. And when I showed up at SAM, I remembered I've never worked so hard in my life. I went from one small group to the next small group. It was like a machine. I think I was in 30 or 40 small groups in like 4 days. My voice was done. I was drinking tea by the gallons. And I remember the first night, I'd been with like 5 or 6 or 7 different small groups. I have no idea what I remember. But at the end, I was with these guys. And again, I was questioning, are you saved? But they're asking questions that the guys that I went to Bible college with didn't even consider. They're asking questions about discipleship and relationship with God. And I was so confused. And I got on the phone that night, and I called my wife, and I said, honey, I don't understand what this is, but I think I've found discipleship. And all of a sudden, I was in a community where I'm looking at something that I believed was going to change the nation of Laos, and they had words to put together the things that God was speaking to us. They had these phrases, these isms, these convictions that all of a sudden began to just register, okay, yeah, that's what that is, and this is how this works. And that was our journey into discipleship and into Chi Alpha. And to fast forward, another 6 years into the future, the Lord began to move upon us to go to Alaska. And there's a whole story there I don't want to get into. But the reason I shared that with you is this simple little reason, is that discipleship and missions, they're totally interconnected. They're not separate. Discipleship and missions are absolutely one and the same. They are what missionaries are called to do, and what you do every single day of the week as a missionary at the campus, and what we do to try to see students come to Christ and become reproducing transgenerational disciple makers in Alaska and around the world, is what missionaries are trying to do overseas in these places. The challenge that we face is making the connection so clear that we understand that our missions manifesto is not separate. I got a chance to sit in Pete Bulette's session yesterday about doing just one thing. And the whole time I'm just cheering this, do just one thing, do just one thing. And when we think about missions in the context of Chi Alpha, you have to understand that this is not separate from small groups. This is not separate from your large group. This is not separate from the other things you do. This is not a department that you have on the side that somehow might help you at some point accomplish something around the world. That this is intrinsically part of what we do every single day. And so I've got 3 real goals that we're going to try to walk through during this time. And the first is this, is we're going to try to walk through a missions conviction, what that looks like, a missions community, and then a missions character. And so the missions community and missions character are more practical, and what we're going to look at as far as what we've seen in Alaska and what we believe will help foster a missions community on your campus and around the world. But I want to start with this idea of a missions conviction. Before we go there, though, I've got to take care of some terms. There's these words that we're going to use, and I just want to explain them a little bit to you under what I would call a missions framework. And this idea of missions. I think the next slide there is the graph. Why don't we walk through that one? So missions is a definition, I would say, is cross-cultural discipleship. John York, I don't know if you guys know Paul York, but it was his dad. He's one of the great missiologists of the Assemblies of God, would essentially say that if everything is missions, nothing is missions. And so we have to be really careful when we use this term, when we talk about missions and missionaries, because it will lose its power and its emphasis. And so for the sake of this time together, we're going to talk about missions as cross-cultural ministry, cross-cultural discipleship. And so this is what they call the E-grid, or, I'm trying to E-framework. A lot of missionaries will go through some sort of training to try to understand this. When we were stuck in Thailand before we moved to Laos, we lived down the hall from another missionary couple, Alan Johnson, who is one of the great missionary thinkers of our community, of our movement. And Alan was constantly filling my head with all sorts of this kind of stuff. But the first is this, and this is where most of us work, is in what we would call the zero barrier or the one barrier, the E0 or the E1. And a zero barrier ministry or discipleship is basically taking someone that's a friend and a family that actually has a Christian culture. They're your church kid that grew up in the church. They understand what you say when you say saved by the blood of the Lamb. They're in it, but they may not have a personal walk relationship with Jesus, and they definitely don't know how to make a disciple. And so you're walking with them. This is the E0, but it basically means there are zero barriers to walking them into a deeper walk with Christ. The first is the E1, and this is, again, probably most of us, when we find someone during Welcome Week, we're talking about essentially a local community, someone from our same culture, but that the barrier that we're facing is Christianity. And so when we're meeting total strangers that haven't grown up in a Christian family on the campus, this is what most of our small group leaders are facing. This is what they're trying to struggle through. They're trying to help someone who they understand their culture, they speak the same language, they live the same kind of life, but they don't get Christ. This is kind of the meridian line right here. I would say that everything E0, E1, everything that we face there, we can't really call missions. That's not missionary effort. That is evangelism, that is discipleship, but that is inside of our culture. When you step below that line and you get into the E2, you're talking about a different but similar culture and dealing with the Christianity, the gap, or the dealing with the barrier of not knowing Christ. And the E2 picture would be a lot of our missionaries in Latin America or in other places that have similar cultures to the United States or have been extremely Christianized. There's this idea that you can have minimal barriers. The E3 barriers you're talking about a different culture, a different language, and primarily, here's the key, is hostile to Christianity. And so for the sake of today, when we're talking about missions, missionaries, missiology, we're talking about the things that are below the grid. They're the E2 and the E3. And it's important for us to kind of understand because we have discipleship, evangelistic ministry efforts that are happening all the time in the 0 and 1 barriers on our campus. But if we're not careful, we're going to step away from our missions mandate, or the Chi Alpha mission statement, which I think I've got on the screen, which I want to remind you about. Our Chi Alpha mission is to reconcile students to Christ, equipping them through spirit-filled communities of prayer, worship, fellowship, discipleship, and mission. Now, that would be great if we stopped right there. And most of us would be totally satisfied. We're like, wow, this is what we're supposed to do. But the people that wrote this mission statement didn't stop there, because this first statement is actually the beginning of what is supposed to be the fulfillment of our mission. You see, this word "to," it means in order that. We do this in order that this will happen. And our mission is to transform the university, the marketplace, and the world. And the way that we do that is by reconciling students. And so if we're not willing to grab hold of this and hold on to the Chi Alpha mission of understanding that, first of all, the university and the marketplace, those are the E0 and the E1 places. But we have no right or ability to abandon the E2, E3, that our responsibility to the university and the marketplace is we're just as responsible to the entire world. We'll get into the motive and all that in a little bit, but let's step into the next term, missionary. There is so much discussion on this in the mission world, in the world. I guess I don't want to get into all sorts of conversation on that, but we're just basically going to say that it's a sent one on God's mission of reconciliation across cultural boundaries. So as we call ourselves Chi Alpha missionaries, most of us are Chi Alpha missionaries not because we've gone into a different culture, but because now the culture has changed so much that we're no longer belonging into it. So as I approach 40, I look at the students and the culture on my campus and I go, man, I am an outsider. And the reason that I'm a missionary in that world is not because I speak a different language or I'm in a hostile environment. It's because I'm no longer culturally similar to the students that I'm ministering to. There's a gap, and as a result, that's the reason we can step into that. Missiology is the next term, and this is just the study of missions, methods, and purposes. I've said it a few times, but I probably won't say that again. The last thing I want to kind of lay down as a foundation piece is this simple idea that you're part of a missions movement. The Assemblies of God was formed in 1914 with one express purpose: to send missionaries. And so Chi Alpha and everything that the Assemblies of God does is for the purpose of the evangelization of the world. And that includes our missions efforts. Essentially, I can read it to you. Brother Hogan was our world missions director, and he says this: in time and in resources, we have come a long way from the hot springs in 1914. And I love this. Nevertheless, we are united with our forefathers in our commitment to evangelize the world. Now you have to understand, when he wrote this, evangelism meant discipleship. Like, that's a term that we've taken and said discipleship encapsulates more than just evangelism and witness, but this is the entirety of what God has called us to do. Nevertheless, we are united with our forefathers in our commitment to evangelize the world, and my prayer is that the urgency to fulfill the Great Commission that fired the souls of those Pentecostals in 1914 will burn just as brightly within us, that the gospel may be preached where Christ is not known. We're going to step into that first goal of what we have this afternoon is to talk about a missions conviction. I did a series of sermons recently on conviction, and I came to the definition that a conviction is basically an enduring belief that is both worth living and dying for. And if there's anything that you guys walk away with today, is that as leaders in your ministries, that if you do not have a conviction for missions, your community and the disciples that you make will not have a conviction for missions. A conviction for missions is a conviction that God's name and his glory will be made known around this world. We literally have to hold that as the most critical thing in our lives and in our ministries, and it is integrated into everything that we do. Listen, I have lived and been in meetings with missionaries where we have sat around the tables, and we've been in persecuted nations where they have said, okay, when someone gets martyred in this nation, what are we going to do? When someone's family is taken hostage, what is our response going to be? How are we going to interact with that nation, with the rest of the missionaries on the field? And I've watched some of these leaders sit and pray and think and discuss and talk and then come to the conclusion that, listen, if one of our missionaries is martyred on the field, we're not going to pull all of our missionaries off of that field. We're going to choose to send more missionaries to that field. And one of the things that I've come to is we were walking with Christ in Laos, and we're going through this conviction in our lives. We began to grasp and understand that, listen, this means both life and death to us. You see, it began for me when I was about 13 years old. I don't know if you guys, many of you remember 13. My son at 13 is 13, and I'm surprised that I remember anything when I was 13 because he is absolutely a mess right now. But my dad handed me a book called Through Gates of Splendor, and I'm reading this story of Jim Elliot. And if you guys know it, it's about these guys that were martyred in Ecuador, and they were basically speared by an Aboriginal tribe, and their bodies were fed to crocodiles, and you just kind of read this story. And it's one of these moments in my life I look back to. It's a foundation stone. It's literally an altar that I kind of remember what God has done. And I remember reading the story of these guys, and there's the quote. Jim says, "How dare I stay and preach to those that have heard thousands of times when there are those in this world that have never heard once." And it just resonated like this sound going through my body. And then he says, "He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." And I'm just going, yeah, that's what this life is about. And I come to the end of the book and I close the page and I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about it and I'm processing what has been said. And I remember so vividly the Lord whispering into my ears, "Paul, are you willing to do that for me?" And that's when the conviction began to be stirred in my heart. And I slid off that bed and my knees hit the floor. And I remember just weeping and saying, "God, if that's what you want for my life, I'm willing to do it." But the conviction really took hold when I was 16. I went on a missions trip, my first missions trip to El Salvador. Do you guys know who Don Triplett is? He's one of the great Assemblies missionaries. He's been in El Salvador for years. Right now, I've heard it's been credited to him that nearly half the population of El Salvador has an evangelical belief system because of his ministry called Castillo del Rey. He mobilized children to be disciple makers. It's profound. But at 16, I was over there, and we did this. We were there half of our trip. We were digging a foundation for a prayer chapel that's had like 24 hours of prayer for 20 years now or something ridiculous like that. And the rest of the time, we were traveling around and going and doing evangelism in different villages. We came to this one village, and we'd done our ministry, and we were sleeping on the floor of this building, and I chose a spot next to a door because it was hot, and I was getting a breeze. And as I laid down, I went to sleep pretty quickly, but around 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up with this sensation that there was something crawling on my face. And so I began to kind of wipe it off, and I had the realization that there actually was something on my face as things started to scatter off of my body. And I rolled over, and I tried to go back to sleep, but I had this strange sensation that was in my ear. And I had the immediate thought that perhaps a spider had crawled into my head. And I tried to ignore it, but the feeling kept getting stronger and I couldn't deal with it. So I rolled over, I grabbed our team leader and I said, hey, you need to wake up. I think there's something inside my ear. And he said, go back to sleep. And I said, absolutely not. I picked him up and I was like, I'm not going back to sleep. To make a long story short, they shined a flashlight in the head. Whatever it was went deeper because it didn't like the light. Then they tried to use a syringe to flush it out. Then we went to the local doctor who had hair sticking up and in his boxers at 2 a.m, who looked, with the stethoscope from the 1950s into my head. And I heard this word in Spanish that I recognized, and he said, La cucaracha. And a cockroach had crawled inside my head, right? And it was excruciatingly painful because it had gotten all the way up against my eardrum. It was scratching against my eardrum. It was this incredible amount of pain. And the missionary shows up at about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. And he basically starts the conversation like this. Remember, I'm 16. He says, Paul, this is crazy. Man, we could take you back to the capital city, San Salvador, get you to a doctor, get that cockroach removed. It'll be great. We'll take care of it. Or we can go to the next village. You see, we've been trying to go to this village for a few years. We've not done it yet. And there are people there that don't know about Jesus. And the choice is yours. And the 16-year-old Paul desperately wanted to say, get this thing out of my head. But the God in Paul said, no, we need to continue. And I remember being so sick. Just equilibrium was messed up. I mean, there's just so much to that story. But laying on the floor of that bus, and the team is doing ministry in this village where there was no established ministry or church. And they're doing puppets and clowns and skits and all the things that happen in places like El Salvador. And as the program came to an end, I remember coming to the edge of the bus window and looking out as people raised their hands for salvation. Little grandmas came forward to be prayed for and kids wanting to walk with the Lord. And it was in that moment that conviction in my heart and in my soul was cemented that this is worth it. You see, listen, guys, if you do not have a conviction that walks you day and night to missions and reaching the world for Jesus Christ that burns inside of your soul, there's no way that it's going to happen on your campus. See, we've been in Alaska for 4 years, pioneered with 2 separate teams, and the Lord has been doing some good things, but probably one of the things that I'm most proud about that God has been doing is the passion for missions in our students' lives. But it's not an accident. We talk about missions. We bring missionaries in. We're always invested in what God is doing. This past year, we were on 7 different trips. We sent 7 trips from our community, and nearly 100 students and staff were around the world and in Alaska doing missions. It's not an accident because our staff and our leadership, we have a conviction and a passion to see the gospel go beyond the borders of our university. Listen, if our goal is to just build a community on the campus, I can promise you that you will make disciples that are narcissistic, egocentric, and selfish, that they're going to focus on themselves and the people around them the rest of their lives. And until we're able to expand their vision and expand their understanding of what God has, not just for the university, not just for the marketplace, but for the world, we're not doing complete discipleship. Do you understand that discipleship, what we do, raising up, reproducing transgenerational men and women who know how to make disciples, is incomplete unless they have a passion to see the world come to know Christ. And it needs to be filtered through everything that we do. Oh, I want to talk about Simon Sinek. You've been wondering where my PowerPoint is. If you guys have heard of Simon Sinek, he's an author. He's also like one of the best TED Talk guys who's watched the most. But I think this was actually mentioned in one of the other sessions I heard yesterday too. But the book Start With Why. This is really revolutionary. And if you think about I don't have time to get into it, but if you think about what's going on in our culture and the reason, even in missions, why people are stepping into things like Live Dead and going to places where they're potentially going to be martyred and laid down is because people have answered the question, why? And in our communities, when we're dealing with missions and establishing a missions manifesto, a missions community, we have to begin with the why, because people don't buy, as he says, what you do, they buy why you do it. And so you can send students on missions trips and not answer the why and really have no impact in their lives. You can bring missionaries into your community and expose them to this other adventure that's halfway around the world, and you'll create tourists. You have to get to the why, that Jesus Christ is worth it. I don't know if you've heard of the sermon 10 shekels in a shirt. I was introduced to it by some friends a number of years ago. But in it, they tell the story of the Moravian missionaries they sell themselves into slaves. And as they get on the boat, they're saying goodbye to their Christian community because they're willing to sell themselves into slavery to reach that community. They say this simple statement, may the lamb that was slain receive the reward of his suffering. And you see, our students have to come to the grips and to the understanding that Jesus Christ is worth it all. That he's worth everything that we have. That he's not just worth part-time, this, that, or the other, but that everything, that Jesus Christ comes first. And that's what I was talking about when I was overseas, surrounded by men and women that had already counted the cost, that had already said, I'm willing to lay down my life. I'm willing to spend my life for whatever God has called me to. It becomes a challenge that when I sit with students and try to disciple them today, and I can't grasp what the world is going through their mind when they say, well, the internship or the Give a Year might be a good idea, but I definitely need to go make money. And I'm going, no, you're missing it. Money's not bad, but you're missing it. Whatever God has for your life, it's the conviction that is an enduring belief that is both worth living and dying for. We have to be a community. As a Chi Alpha nation, listen, as a Chi Alpha movement, if we do not get this right, we will become ingrown. And we have got to continue to push out. That's why CMC and what God is doing through the connections with AGWM and AGUSM is so powerful. It's so powerful. All right, moving on. In a minute, we're going to get into some pragmatics, and I'm going to give us some time to interact. All right. So motive is incredibly important. Mentality. I want to address something that I've heard a number of times. It's this idea of mentality of missions. I've heard it more than once that someone will come to me and essentially ask, well, if I focus on missions, nobody will stay. And I just want to address this. It's really a mentality of scarcity. We as a movement need to walk through ministry with open hands. And the greatest success that we have as disciple makers is seeing our disciples be sent into the world. If we're not willing to shift our mentality of scarcity of we need people to come home, we need people to stay because we've got to keep the home base going, we're not trusting that what God has raised up and what God has called, he can replace and fulfill in our communities. One of the things I loved about sitting at SAM when we did our internship there was getting to interact with Jason Bell. And Jason would often talk about trying to sink the ship, that they would try to give away so many people that it would actually cause SAM Chi Alpha to collapse. And that was an actual effort, a desire to see how many people that they could send to see what would happen, what God could do. There was a mentality that you cannot make more baby birds until the baby birds have left the nest. And that there's this necessity of moving people out into what God has called them to. And if we do not change our mentality of scarcity, we're going to continue to have basically inbred disciples that don't know how to look beyond what God has called them to. The third thing is this, that it's a mandate. I feel like I've hit this over and over again. But in Matthew 9:38 and in Luke 10:2, Jesus tells his disciples to basically pray for laborers in the harvest. And I think it's ironic, in just a few chapters later in Matthew 28, he essentially says, guess what? You're the laborers. Go out into the harvest, right? This is not an option for us, friends. This is not something that we can say, well, it's on the side, or it's something that we'll do. This is who we are. This is what we're called to. When Crystal and I were called to Alaska, it was probably the hardest thing that I've ever experienced in my life. We were serving in Southeast Asia, and we felt a shift was coming. We've been involved in pioneering different ministries, establishing the house churches, translating the Fire Bible. We'd served in country leadership and in area leadership, and we were living what we thought God had called us to since we were children. But we were feeling a stirring in our hearts, and there were different regions of the country we were going to that we were living in that we thought we needed ministry planted and pioneered in. And so we thought that we would be going to another area of that nation. And we committed to go over a season of prayer and fasting. I was in Bangkok, Thailand for some meetings. And we decided that while I was gone, we were going to pray and fast about what the next step of missions was going to be for our lives. And to make a very long story short, I was in that time of prayer, and the Lord spoke to me, and he essentially said 2 words or 3 words, go to Alaska. And I laughed out loud, and then realized that this was actually the Lord speaking, and it wasn't a funny matter. And I got really angry. I got really upset because I didn't understand what God was doing. We were serving in a nation that statistically is 0% Christian. And we're one of the few handful of disciple makers that know the language, that are working there. And I couldn't wrap my mind around it strategically. And the Lord just began to speak to me in that moment about what he was calling us to. And he basically said 3 things. The first is that what we'd learned in Asia, we were supposed to bring to Alaska. The second is that we weren't going to go alone. And there's 2 teams that went and pioneered to Alaska. But the third was essentially this, is that, I'm actually drawing a blank. The third was, what we started in Asia would continue. Thank you, baby. The point is that in that moment, as we were sitting and wrestling with the call from Asia to Alaska, I felt like we were abandoning what God had called us to so many years ago. But as we were wrestling through that statement, the Lord told us that we would be able to replace ourselves 10-fold, 100-fold in sending missionaries back into the Buddhist world and into the Asia world. We'll talk about that in just a minute, but the last thing that we need to cover there is just this idea of having a bit bigger vision than yourself. I don't know if you're all directors or if you serve on campus staffs, but let me challenge each and every one of us to have a vision that goes beyond our local community. If you want to grow your community, challenge your students to think beyond your community. If you do it for the wrong motive and the wrong heart, it will implode on you. But the fastest way to fix your finances is to start to give to God. The fastest way to see your community begin to grow is to start pouring your community into the heartbeat of what God has for this world. All right, let's talk about missions community and developing a mission strategy. After this, we'll open it up for some questions and some discussions, and then I'll try to get into, if we have time, into what I would call missions character. But the first step that we have taken in our Alaska Chi Alpha is this idea of missions exposure. And so from the beginning of the year, we basically have missions on the forefront of what we do. It starts with conversations. I mean, I'm a missionary, and so it's easy for me to illustrate our sermons with stories from missions, but missions biographies, missions trips, all of these things are highlighted in our conversations, in our services, in our small groups. From there, we're not just doing that, we're doing what we would call a missions month or missions 3 weeks in November. I usually preach a sermon on missions in the heart of God. We usually bring in a missionary and we present a missions project. And so our community is going to take an offering to invest in that. From there, we're going to not just have missionaries come, but we're going to do meals with the missionary. We're going to set up one-on-ones with those that are feeling called with missions. We're going to get them into small groups. All of this stuff, listen, this is not rocket science. But when you're willing to set it aside and say, okay, this is going to be a strategic piece of what we do in our discipleship, to complete discipleship in the lives of our students, it begins to take powerful form and shape in their lives. The second phase, it would be this, is what I would call a missions experience. And our first missions experience for our students is our missions offering in the year. So the way that we do this, we've stolen it from some of the other Chi Alphas, is that we start to talk to our small group leaders at our leadership meetings about the offering. We introduce them to our missionary. The missionary has a specific project, and then we challenge our small groups to raise funds as a group to help support and invest in this missions project. The second piece would be getting our students on basically a missions trip. As I said before, I don't know if I said it or not, but we had nearly 100 students on missions this past year. That's fully 25% of our disciples in Alaska. So our goal is to see, obviously, 100% of our students have a missions experience during their career in the university. Everybody needs to go at some point and have an experience overseas, cross-cultural missions, because it will open up their hearts, their minds to what God wants to do. But a missions trip is not just, hey, here's a ticket, have a good time. Hopefully the missionary has a great program and it's a good experience for you. For us, missions trips start around the same time. In November, we do a reveal. Essentially, as we're going through our missions weeks, we have the mission speaker, the missions offering, and then the missions reveal. We do not let our students choose where they want to go. They are allowed to apply for a trip, and they can choose like their top choice, their second choice, and their third choice. And then our staff sits around and basically identifies what we believe a good, healthy team looks like. We're trying to put our small group leaders and small group members together. We're trying to create that discipleship dynamic that we're hoping for. Shortly after that, we're going to do a support raising training. It's going to be before Thanksgiving, because they need to have the opportunity to head home, to start talking to their family and friends about what God has called them to. They're going to have Christmas break to raise those funds. And then after Christmas break, we're going to do a missions training. The missions training is a 2-day overnight event. And our job there is to basically pull out of them all the things that they're going to experience on a missions trip. And so it is intentionally hard. It is food depriving, so we serve bad food, we serve little food. We keep them up till way all hours of the night. Many of you may be familiar with Bafa. Some of you, I know, right? If you don't know what Bafa is, it is a culture simulation game. We divide our students into 2 groups. They are given cultures, languages, all sorts of rules of life. And then we basically take some of the group from Group A, and they have to visit Group B, and Group B gets to visit Group A, and it causes all sorts of fun moments, crying. I've heard lots of cussing. I've heard all sorts of interesting exchanges about how I hate this and I never want to do this again. But it pulls out all these moments of vulnerability, of stress, of anxiety, of things that they're going to face when they hit the mission field. This past year, we sent teams to Burma, Thailand, and India. Those are our overseas trips. And all 3 of the missionaries that we worked with told me the exact same thing. We've never had teams as prepared for what they would encounter as what your teams have done. And one of our missionaries in Burma, who I knew because that was the area that we were involved with and overseas, the question was how did you do that? And I was like, well, we did a missions training. And she goes, wow, I'm going to have all my teams do that. And I'm just like, well, that only makes sense, right? It only makes sense to prepare them for what they're going to go through. One of the other strategic goals is community. So we're putting our teams together. We're trying to get them to start to basically become one unit, to build relationships, because some of these people have been plucked from the different ends of our community, and so they've never encountered one another. And so that would be the next step as far as getting them into that missions experience, support raising. Another key piece here is what I would say is the longer than 2 weeks. This is very controversial, at least with most leaders who have to go on these trips. But over the last couple of years, I've started polling missionaries and some of my other Chi Alpha friends that have a strong missions emphasis manifesto in their ministries. And the belief or the understanding is simply this, is that a 2-week trip is just not long enough. It's not long enough for our overseas missionaries, and it's not long enough for our students to really get over some of the challenges that they face in their lives when they encounter a culture. So this past year, we focused on 3 weeks. We may end up doing a month, but what that means is that for the leaders that are on that trip, is that it's an incredible time investment into their lives, into a very small group of students, into their lives and what God is doing overseas. Let me give you an example of what happened on our trip to India. I got to lead that group. We were with my friend Joe Gordon, who spoke at CMC. We served in Laos together for 8 years, and we went to India primarily because of relationship. I want to take and focus our ministries on a specific area of the world, the Buddhist Asian world. India falls outside of that. It's mostly Hindu. But because of relationship, we went there because I love my brother and I trust my brother, because I'm not going to take my students anywhere that I'm not going to have them be willing to go and serve and partner with. And so we're there, and our students got a great select group of students, because this is a trekking wilderness hike into the Himalayas. We're going to unreached tribes and villages, and so this is the elite group, right? These are the best of the best. I've chosen the people that I think I can trust the most. They had athletic requirements, food requirements, all sorts of, we made this incredibly difficult. We had one of these students about 2 days in, break down on the trail. We'd probably 18 or 19 miles up into this place, and they had it. Started crying, saying they wanted to go home, wasn't going to do it anymore, wouldn't get up. And I am an incredibly compassionate, kind, caring person who looked at that person and said, "Buckle up, Buttercup. Let's go. The only way out of this is to keep moving forward." And one of the things that we have to understand in this moment, listen, is that we need to be willing to challenge them beyond 2 weeks. So what's interesting is that same person who struggled on day 2 was still having a bad attitude by day 7, but by day 14, 15, 16, they were loving what we were doing. And they're the ones that are saying, "I think I'm called, I want to go back." This is one of those moments, or that ideas that I think is really important for us to grasp, because if we go for too short of a time, we are tourists. And we need to give them enough exposure to what life is like on the mission field that's going to open up their eyes and give them the courage to say, "I can do this the rest of my life." The other key thing that I mentioned here is that relational and repetitive in missionary partners. I would not build missions programs on kind of the shotgun effect. Like I said before, we're not going to take missions trips to people we don't know, to relationships we don't have. I would say that you need to keep going back to those places. You need to build relationships, and it needs to be long-term. Because if our goal is to open up the doors and the minds for some of our students to choose world missions as something that they see as God's calling on their lives, they've got to have those relationships that are going to help them walk into that stage of what God's called them to. All right. The third phase that we want to talk about is missions mobilization. And this is really simple. I would say that we are really intentional about having altar opportunities for a call to missions. Our CMIT program is very focused and has an intentionality on missions and missions trips and time with missionaries. We see Give a Year as a missions endeavor. And then the piece for Alaska that may be a little bit unique is that we see Alaska as our own missions field. And so we've got missions in our backyard in a way that most states don't. We have hundreds of villages of 300, 500, 700 people that are disconnected from the modern world, that have their own distinct cultures, they have their own distinct needs, they have incredible challenges. And so we believe that we have a responsibility to find that in our backyard. But here's what's happened. Listen, I would challenge you to find missions in your backyard. But because we have a very clear strategic effort for missions in our backyard of Alaska, we have developed and are developing a training program to mobilize our students into effective missions in Alaska and hopefully around the world. When I started to explore this idea, I called U.S. Missions and I asked the question, do we have a training center for cross-cultural U.S. missions in this country? And as far as I understand it, from the national office, outside of the CMIT program, we have no training programs for U.S. missionaries in this country inside the Assemblies of God. There is no one that is saying, I have developed a program to help our missionaries in the U.S. start walking through the cultural challenges of becoming a missionary in this place. But listen, what we see Live Dead doing with these centers, have you guys know what I'm talking about? The Live Dead centers where you go and you spend your first 2 years and you learn language and you're starting to be coached and trained. I believe that we need to have some sort of understanding or facilitation of that kind of mobilization in our CMIT program. That whether there's a separate track or something separate or distinct that will help us be able to mobilize our students that are saying they're called to missions. One of the challenges that we're facing right now is that in Alaska, nobody knows what's supposed to be done. After 100 years of mission efforts in Alaska, we have 3 indigenous pastors. We have 3 native believers that are leading church communities. We as a community of Chi Alpha have to begin to exegete the world in which we live and prepare our students to become effective missionaries around the world. We'll take a few minutes to ask the question, if you guys have questions about what we do as far as Alaska Chi Alpha with missions, and or just either thoughts or comments about what we can do. We'll just go from there, and I'll walk around with the microphone. Yep.
Do you have any good books that you recommend?
Sure. It's the last slide. I've got a number of books that we really encourage. And some of these, so Celtic Way of Evangelism, I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's the story of St. Patrick. It's been around for a long time. Bruchko is a book I've read recently. It's been around a little bit, but the reason that's on this list is because it is probably the best book I've ever read on practical missiology. So this is a missionary that figured out what it meant to live in a way to bring Christ into a community that he could be understood in a way that it changed entire tribal groups. It's profound. Christ of the Indian Road, this is again a missiological book of helping us understand what it means to bring Christ cross-culturally into the Indian context. E. Stanley Jones has written a number of books, just profound, really, really great. Through Gates of Splendor, it's one of my favorite. I give it to students all the time. Apostolic Function. I mentioned Alan Johnson. We lived in Bangkok with them down the hall for a little bit more than a year. And that's his book looking at missions and the mission call as an apostle's call. Super good. And then I just said missionary biographies. If you want to stir the heart of students, hand them missionary biographies. Help them start to be exposed to missionaries, their stories, the things that God can do around the world and he can do through their lives. Surely there's questions about missions.
You mentioned at the very beginning, if we pretty much dilute the definition of missions and the sending of people to include more than what it actually is, then it loses its importance. And so, for people who don't feel called to missions and you say that you feel called to the workforce, how do you navigate, especially us here that are kind of our main responsibility on staff is talking about missions, just missions in general. How do you pretty much promote missions and fight for students to think about going overseas or giving and praying without diminishing the importance of workplace discipleship?
Yeah, so I think that's I don't think they're definitely, so here's the problem is that missions, and one of the conversations I had with another Chi Alpha pastor recently was this idea that missions is really attractive. Like, man, you get to go do this stuff and you travel around the world and you get these crazy good stories. And it's just like, it's the superstars of the Christian world. And those that enter into the workforce and don't necessarily do this with their lives full time are somehow second class, and that's not true. I think the emphasis that we talk about, I understand very keenly that a smaller percentage of the church is called to cross-cultural ministry, but all of us are called to cross-cultural ministry. And all of us need exposure and experiences in cross-cultural ministry to value that. And so when I would say, when we're crafting our missions emphasis or our missions manifesto at the University of Alaska, we're saying, listen, every one of our students needs to walk through this, but we understand probably only 2 to 5% are actually going to step into full-time missions. But that's biblical too. I mean, how many Apostle Pauls were there? How many Timothys were there? How many? It's okay that they're not a part in that words are hard, in that specific avenue of ministry. But they've got to understand the importance and they participate, whether that's hosting missionaries or supporting missionaries or praying for missionaries. It's got to become the emphasis of our, not just Chi Alpha, but of the whole church, that the gospel needs to go around the world, that every single person needs to have the opportunity to make a decision for Christ or not. And frankly, that Jesus Christ is worth it. He's worth, and he deserves it. It's not just worth it, he deserves his name to be glorified everywhere. And so some of the most godly people I know are lay people, but they're taking their own family missions trips, or they support 100 different missionaries. And I've got a guy that has supported us for years. We sat down across the table and he goes, he asked essentially the same question. I feel like God has called me to make money. And I looked at him as bold as I could. I said, well, if God has called you to make money, then you should live on as little as you can and you should give the vast majority away. And he's, okay, I guess that's what I should do. But we need to empower people and we need to connect the dots for them. We need to connect the dots that this is not something that's outside of what God has called you to do. Because we can do, hey, I'm called to be a small group leader. And we see this all the time. They leave school and they're done being a small group leader. If that's the case, we failed. We failed because we're called to make disciples for the rest of their lives. And we're talking like that piece about mobilization of people into missions. Probably a greater need in our communities is figuring out how to mobilize our non-ministry graduates into a full lifetime of discipleship making. I don't have time to get into it all, but one of the things that we're working on right now in Alaska is that we do not believe that missionaries and ministers are the key to our villages. We don't need more missionaries. We don't need more ministers. We need more disciple makers. And the key way into our villages is through teaching. I was in a village called Atkasuk. And Atkasuk had 7 high school science teachers by February. So 7 different high school science teachers had come and gone from August to February. No one will stay in these places. These are some of the most God-forsaken places in the world. But imagine what would happen if 3 couples showed up teaching degrees. They knew they were called to be missionaries in this village to start disciples. The government's going to pay off their entire school debt if they're willing to stay 3 years. They're being supported, trained, mobilized to do cross-cultural ministry. I believe that that's just as much missions as being an AGWM missionary. And so what you're talking about is, yeah, I'm called to the marketplace, but the key is connecting them. Yeah, I'm called to the marketplace, but I'm called to missions in the marketplace. And that may not be what we would call cross-cultural missions, but I'm called to discipleship. Anyway, I'm sorry, I kind of went on a rant. Other questions, thoughts? Yeah.
Practical question. When you're talking about staff leading these trips, do you guys build the cost of these trips, yearly trips, into your monthly budget? Do you raise extra support for it? Do the students' cost cover staff costs? How do you guys do that?
Yeah, so I'm a firm believer of making life hard. But not necessarily for my staff. So we build into the budget that the students raise all of the airfare. So they're raising portion for the staff. So they're raising portions of it. This past year, we had an intern-led mission trip to Burma, which is great. And we're slowly moving ourselves as staff out of that responsibility all the time. We are trying to move into more either intern or older student-led trips. It's got to be a special, unique student to be able to do something like that, primarily because we're choosing to go to places that we believe are hard and that are going to be more challenging and even health dangerous. So, those are some of those things. But yeah, practically we try to help our staff be able to do these without huge burdens.
So there's probably lots of people in the room that have very small staff teams.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go as a staff, when, end of the year, there's one or two of you to choose to go, whole family?
Yep. I mean, I've been on 4 mission trips been on 5 mission trips the last 4 years. The month of May, I got home. Less than a week after school ended, spent 3+ weeks in India, and just part of that because I see it as a strategic piece. Now, I will say this. So I understand what you're saying. My staff is currently 7. We had a situation where we lost a couple staff mid-year, and they were supposed to take the trip to India. And so the conversation was, well, I guess we need to cancel that trip. And I was like, absolutely not. We are not canceling that trip. That's like canceling our discipleship leadership training. We are not doing that because it is a critical piece of who we are and what we do. And so when you're thinking through these things, you just have to say, is this one of those cost-benefit analysis things? The longer trips are going to cost more. And if you have a smaller staff, you might only do 1 trip a year instead of 7 or 6 or whatnot. The other piece is working in relationships with missionaries over and over. The trips get a lot easier. I mean, when I go back to Laos, when I take teams to Laos, it is like a vacation for me. I speak the language. I know everybody. We're going to the places that I love, where we pioneered. This is great. And when you build those relationships, even though you may not have spent 8 or 9 years there, you're going to be able to go back and see people. The stress on you, the students are still going to be stressed, but on you is going to be way different. So. We haven't yet. They lived with me when we were there, but they haven't at this point. We've been discussing, what does that look like? Primarily in Alaska. The last 4 years, I've been going overseas with our teams, and I've done village trips alone, but not with our students. And so that's probably going to be the next phase of us as we start to make that a much bigger priority in our ministry, because we really believe that God has positioned us there for that. I'll tag this on. I think that there needs to be strategic partnerships in Chi Alpha. It's not been a secret. I've said from the moment we left the Asia-Pacific Buddhist world that we are sending people back to Asia-Pacific and the Buddhist world, that my missions trips are going to the Asia-Pacific, the Buddhist world. And that's just because we can't go everywhere and be effective. A rifle is much more effective than a shotgun, and that's just kind of our philosophy. And so if we start seeing strategic partnerships, Live Dead Middle East, Sam has loved on that for a long time. And like 80% of Live Dead missionaries in the Middle East, guess what? They're Sam, right? Because you get called to where you go, to where you're exposed to. Does that make sense? All right. Yeah.
Hey, how do you roll your teams out? How do you roll your trips out practically? Is it in a meeting? Is it a special meeting?
You mean with?
After the meeting, like you've taken 3 mission trips this year. What does the initial rollout look like
Yeah, so it's a service, like for our students to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be part of our missions emphasis, 2 to 3 weeks of what is missions, missionary special offering. And so usually that third week we've been talking about trips are coming. We've introduced our missionary and our project, and they've been raising money for 3 weeks. And so that last night, there's this kind of rollout of, hey, these are the places we're going. At the end of the service, the altar response is, you need to find a place to pray and ask the Lord where he wants you to go. And the push is that God is calling you, and what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to give financially, but also what are you willing to give the rest of your life, as far as not the rest of your life, but your time, your energy. And for some of our students in Alaska, you can make 30 to 50 grand in a summer fishing. And for some of them, that means they give up that to go on a mission trip to India because they can't get on a boat because the boat's already gone. And so it's significant. It's a big deal. But the Lord, I believe in making things hard, because you don't want to get people overseas and they're all of a sudden, well, I didn't sign up for this. Anyway, other questions? Yep.
We also have a smaller account. Do you find it successful, like when you guys were starting out? We've always done one a year, but with the smaller group, you get more response from students, more students signing up, I guess, if you have multiple trips, because they don't have the excuse of, my grandparents' anniversary that week.
I find that as many trips as we put out, people will fill. And right now, we took the number of trips because of our capacity to do those trips, not because students wouldn't fill the trips. So our first year, we were a typical Chi Alpha plant. It was our conviction that missions was going to be a part of our culture, of our DNA. And the first year, we went on a missions trip to rural Alaska. It wasn't, hey, we're going halfway around the world, but we are going to be involved in missions. And those students that are now seniors and graduates, man, it's part of their life. And some of these students have been on mission trips every year, and they've been around the world with us because they see this as a critical part. And this is a bonus, guys. A lot of our students support my staff because they've drawn the connection that missionaries need support because they've been exposed to missionaries. And so we've got students that are still students supporting our staff $25, $30, $50 a month, because not because they've been asked, but because they connected the dots and said, wow, my pastor's a missionary. He probably needs help. All right. Other questions? Yep.
When you first got to Alaska, the staff you had, did they all have similar, if not the same, conviction?
The team that went to Alaska, to Fairbanks, was all Sam. We had some Sam and North Dakota State go to Anchorage. And I would say that everybody, primarily the Welches, have a real strong conviction of missions because they ran missions at Sam. Everybody had an understanding of missions, but I don't know. I think everybody has a much more commitment to missions now, mainly because I won't stop talking about it. It's just that bug in people's ears that this is so critical. Can I throw one little story out there? I remember our first year, we're sitting in our living room. We've got a couple dozen students and staff sitting around, and we're talking, and I'm casting vision. We're going to change the world. Like, this is going to change the world. Alaska Chi Alpha is going to, and just going down about how some of you are going to end up in villages doing ministry, and about going overseas, and just casting that vision. And one of the smart Alex raised his hand. He goes, so what you're saying is we're not good enough. I'm like, excuse me? He's like, yeah, we're not good enough. We're just going, we're just the cog in the machine to go. I'm like, no, that's not what I'm saying. Number one, the Lord gave me grace because I was going to choke him to death. But what I was saying was, what I told him was, listen, man, the Lord cares about you. You're good enough because we're here. God's pulled people from all around this country so that you can learn to walk with Jesus. But it goes back to that motive, to that why. Listen, if we cannot literally believe with all of our hearts and all of our souls that Jesus Christ is worth it, what I mean is that he needs to be declared in every single solitary place in this world. you're not really following Christ. I mean, I know that's radical, but listen, this is the foundation of Scripture, that Jesus Christ needs to be proclaimed, that every tribe, tongue, and nation needs to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. There was other hands. I'm getting on my bandwagon, or my whatever, rabbit trails. Anybody else?
Or how would you describe some of the change you've seen in your staff as that conviction has become more real through Jim?
I mean, primarily for Alaska, I mean, the difference is that they're seeing that our discipleship efforts aren't complete until our students are mobilized. So we finished 4 years, and we're starting to see students consider the internship and consider ministry as a career. And we're confronted with this, okay, well, what's the next step? How do we mobilize every single one of our students into a lifetime of discipleship? Because the conclusion is that it's not just to reconcile students to Christ. The conclusion is to change university marketplace in the world. And so there's this mentality shift that we're not done when they walk the line. I think that's the biggest thing, is that we're not done. We've just got to, there's a whole nother effort of discipleship that needs to continue. And we still have a responsibility to them because we have a responsibility to the world. All right. Yeah.
It's going to take us a little more of a different direction, but I work directly with XII.
Mm-hmm.
I was curious if, like, something like your program, training program, would be really good for international students that become Christians here in America and go through the entry process, how that could benefit them. Because there's a lot of internationals that go to their countries, don't know how to disciple at all, and fall away from the faith.
Yes. So I do. We had Fairbanks does not attract large quantities of international students. It's like negative 56. It is not first choice on anybody's list. But we had our first international student go through our leadership training. We only get them for 1 year usually, and so they're and gone. Her name's Mitsuho, and Mitsuho's from Japan. She went to India with us. She flew home from India to Japan, and we're networking with her to try to help connect her. Her hometown does not have a Chi Alpha, doesn't have that stuff, so we're trying to work with her with that. But that's an intriguing idea, because this is a whole different subject, but there would be there's an intriguing idea of somehow coaching or somehow training people to be specifically aware of their own culture. So this is a whole different conversation, but cultural contextuality, this is more missiology than what we've been talking about. An insider is someone inside your home culture, and you see things specifically certain ways. An outsider sees things differently because you're looking from the outside. And so typically an insider is blind to certain things, and an outsider doesn't understand. Like they see things, but they can't grasp why. And so being able to take an individual, an insider that has the ability to exegete their culture, do you understand what I mean by that? To be able to pick apart their own culture and see how to bring the gospel in it is incredibly rare. It's what I would call the Apostle Paul personality. And so giving people the tools to be both Jew and Greek, because that's what he was able to do. He was able to minister to Greeks because he was Greek, but he was also 100% Jew. And so being able to do that is critical. And yeah, that's a really long answer to yes, I think that would be beneficial to international students if we could train them to exegete their cultures and make disciples there, probably better than just saying, hey, this is how we do it in America, because it's radically different. The principles of discipleship are the same around the world. Some of the tools that we use are different. So, yep.
What you're doing, practical question. Half dozen trips, staff sits down and makes placements with students. Is there a range of financial and overall time commitment levels that you're assigning students to that you're choosing? So, for example, this student, hey, you're headed to India, $2,500, 3 weeks. This other student, hey, you applied to, thank you, you're headed to this village 300 miles from here. It's going to be a week and a half trip, $500. Is the staff making those decisions and the ability for students?
Students they choose, so like they'll choose first choice, second choice, third choice. So like our trip to India, when it got promoted, I think everybody put it as their first choice because, we're trekking in the Himalaya mountains for 3 weeks and, just everybody's like, wow, I want to do that. And you're from Alaska. A lot of it was very much like, no, this doesn't work for you or this particular situation. But everybody gets a call and an explanation. And everybody can back out. Like, they don't have to. Like, hey, we don't think that India is right for you this year. We'd like you to go to Thailand. We think Thailand's going to be a little bit better introduction to world missions for you. And we're going to, let us know what you think if that's where you want to go. And so we have people shuffle and move and stuff. And we've made, don't think this year, but the year before, we've made kind of second decisions. So we've had someone come and say, man, I really, really believe the Lord has called me and that I'm supposed to be on this trip. And we went back, we prayed, and we said, well, if you can raise the budget, we'll let you go. And so this is not like hard, fast rules. What we're trying to do is to facilitate a missions experience that moves them one more step into the walk with Christ, and a step closer into a lifetime of missions discipleship. We do. We've really. So I've kind of gotten way off, but CMC is really, not CMC, but the World Mission Summit is really critical. We see that as a key component. I didn't mention that earlier. But that year we didn't do a spring break trip to take people to CMC. We usually stay as local as possible. World Mission Summit, sorry. We try to stay as local as possible, so it's almost always an in-state trip. This year we went to Juneau because we're hoping to pioneer a campus ministry. And then one of our other teams went to one of the boarding schools for our native students because we're expanding into those areas. This spring we're going to all 3 villages that host boarding schools for native students in the state. So we're gonna have teams in all 3 of those places. Yeah, it's time. So if you guys need to leave, you can split. I'm happy to stay as long as you want.